right, I'm here today on Office Hours with Stephen Shapiro, who is one of the top speakers on the innovation circuit. He's written a number of very popular books, including Personality Poker and Why Best Practices Are Stupid or Best Practices Are Stupid, which is one of my favorite books. It's filled with a lot of very good advice. He's worked with a lot of the top companies around the world. He's got some tremendous insights to innovation. Stephen, welcome to Office Hours.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you. So I want to start out because you've got a lot of history with this, and you've got a very kind of counterintuitive belief system about innovation, which I really like. But I want to start out with, what is the number one thing leaders get wrong about leading innovation? What's the one thing that almost everywhere you go, people get upside down?
If I choose the one thing, I would say is we get so enamored with ideas, whether it's suggestion boxes or idea management, so we're inundating companies and this weight of so many ideas and suggestions, and we're not really focusing on what the important business problems are.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that you talk a lot about is that thinking out of the box is really not that good of an idea. So what is the good idea that we really should replace that with?
Well, I say don't think outside the box, find a better box. So I've done a number of studies which show that the more abstract the question, so the more you think outside the box, the more irrelevant and the lower quality the solutions. So the issue isn't expansiveness, but if you're looking in one place, you might just need to reframe the question. And sometimes it's as simple as changing one word to unleash a whole new set of possible solutions.
Now, talk a little bit about this idea. One of the things I write a lot about is this concept of dominant logic, that organizations kind of have dominant logic and they can't escape it, so they really don't see what's right in front of them. And I know you write a lot about this, not only in terms of personalities, but in terms of cultures. Tell us a little bit about sort of the challenges of dominant logic and how we might get around it.
Well, I think what ends up happening is that, I say expertise is the enemy of innovation, because our past experience creates blinders. And for a couple of reasons. One is, first of all, we believe our past success is going to lead us to future success, but in fact, almost the exact opposite is what typically happens. But the other thing is it just creates these neural pathways in the brain to things that we think about so regularly that we quickly jump to conclusions and don't explore other options. So it's really about exploration and figuring out what's really most important.
Now, I know one thing that you write about that we have in common is I write a lot about the creative power of constructive conflict. And a lot of my work on Wall Street is predicting share prices, looking at this in a very different way, comparing it to sort of traditional metrics. There's sort of a two-part question here. Tell me a little bit about the role of this tension, of these different ideas, and how we might manage that. And then talk a little bit about your work on metrics. And I know you do a lot of thinking around, are we measuring the right things? So talk a little bit about how we manage this kind of these different ideas.
Yeah, and I think you're the master of the creative tension area. I think, what the work that you've done is just really fascinating in that area. I look at it through a couple of different lenses than you do, which is personality conflict, which is a good thing, because I always say if you hire people who fit the mold, the company will eventually grow mold. So what we need to do is start recognizing that we have to hire people who don't fit the mold and people we might not necessarily get along with. But that's, this belief that opposites attract isn't true.
Right.
Like attracts like. So that's the first one. But then it's also conflict of discipline. So one of the things which I'm big into is how do we bring people from different disciplines, purposefully or not, that we are able to mash together. So like one of the examples which I love is a group in Houston called Pumps and Pipes.
Yep.
It is a group of cardiologists and gas pipeline engineers who get together on a regular basis, and they share a fluid through a tube is the common thing, and they apply the cardiovascular system to the transmission of gas. And I think it's a really fascinating model to start creating those types of tensions.
Yeah, now talk a little bit about measures. Now, what are the challenges of measurement? I know you write a lot about this. What do we get wrong, and what can we do to get it right?
Well, measures are tough. A lot of the measures that we have don't necessarily lead us in the right path. So to me, what I'm looking at, I look at the whole world through the question, the challenge. So I call it challenge-centered innovation. Mm-hmm. And if we look at the world through that, then what we're really looking at is the quality of the questions, the solve rate of the questions. The problem with ideas is we look for quantity. I'm not looking for quantity. I want a high signal to noise ratio. I want a high solve rate. So solve rate is actually one of my primary measures in the beginning because that helps us predict. Then we can start looking at implementation rates, and ultimately we can look at returns. Yep. But in many companies, in many industries, as you know, we don't see returns on innovation for years, or in pharmaceuticals, decades.
Yep.
So we need to have enough measures up front that are going to predict the future, not just wait for the future to tell us whether we were right or wrong.
Now, how do we do that? One of the big challenges that I'm sure you face, I face it all the time, is shareholder pressure. You know, you got to show something this quarter. You know, everything's sort of traded on the street. The market is, you know, right now kind of ridiculous, but it is what it is, right? How do we demonstrate to the investors in our companies that they should kind of hold on and wait until this pays out? Do you have any sort of tricks of the trade?
I don't think there's any great tricks to the trade other than giving a number of stories about how it will actually work out. I think that the best way to get people to take action is not on the opportunity side, but on the threat side. And so what I try to do is paint a compelling picture of what is the downside of not following the advice we're talking about, because people will take action to deal with a problem, a pain, or a threat. But if you say, hey, if you innovate, look at the great things that are going to happen, they're like, yeah, but look at the 1,000 other things I have to do. So it's a little bit of psychology in terms of how do we get people motivated to actually want to move forward with some of the initiatives we're talking about.
Yeah, I think Amazon these days is a great example. Remember, it didn't make money until like 3 years ago. And everyone was like, well, you know, it's really not going to pay. And these are convex forms of value. So when it shows up, you're done, you know, put a fork in it. So it's kind of interesting. Now, talk a little bit about competitiveness. One of the things that you write a lot about is differentiation and the difference between difference and differentiation. But I want to focus this a little bit more on this idea of communities, what we used to call in the old days creativity clusters. You know, that there's certain parts of this country and the world that seem to produce a lot more intellectual property that's valuable. Tell me about and the reason this is important is all these communities are now doing this cookie cutter stuff and trying to create the same result. And of course, they're not differentiated and they can't, right? Give us some advice. If you were a community leader, I know you're not, but if you were, what kind of advice would you give us in order to really create a creativity cluster that was really going to be dynamite in generating real valuable innovations?
Well, and that's one of the things which I'm trying to do right now down here in Florida. I moved to Orlando, which we're trying to create as a hub in the innovation space. And, you know, we can't be Silicon Valley. We can't be even necessarily Austin. So we have to figure out what is that makes us unique. And so to me, the key thing with differentiation is figuring out what is going to make you most successful that's going to be difficult for someone else to replicate and it won't be disrupted. And if you have those three things coming together, then I think that's usually the key for being able to identify your differentiator. And then you innovate where you differentiate, which basically I say, don't try to be the best at everything else. Figure out the one or two or three things that you have to excel at and partner with other people for everything else, which is why the clusters become very powerful, because if each player in a cluster differentiates, but we can put them together like puzzle pieces, then you have a really powerful situation.
So what does Orlando do to differentiate? What's the secret sauce down there? Or can you see?
Well, I think at this point it's very interesting because I'm originally from Boston, moved down here a couple of years ago, and in the early days, Orlando tried to use the Boston approach. The problem, though, is Boston, having lived there, is a very close-knit, private, unless you're in the in crowd, you don't get anything done.
Right.
Well, Orlando can't do that because they didn't have the Harvards and the MITs and all the other clusters that were up there. So transparency, I think, is really a big part of what they're trying to do here is make sure everybody can participate and play and open it up as much as possible. And given I'm a guy who's a huge fan of open innovation, this concept of openness and transparency definitely works for me.
Well, it's funny. You think about Boston, and even like Cornell now has moved their innovation center to Boston, and that's what's happening. People are moving to these places. I live in this little bitty town called Ann Arbor, which has more venture capital per person than any city in the world, but it's little tiny town in the middle of sort of everywhere else. Now, one of the things I think a lot about is how innovations actually radically changed. I come from the field of artificial intelligence. That's what my PhD's in. And it's funny to me, now we're starting to see a whole nother kind of epoch of innovation where machines are creating machines and things that are real are not really real and genomes are creating genomes or the informatics, et cetera. Tell me where you see innovation going next. What's kind of the next big curve, not so much in the outcome, but in how we innovate?
Well, I think, first of all, as you're pointing out with all these different, whether it's AI or virtual reality, augmented reality, 3D printing, and all these other new technologies that are emerging, we have the ability to do things in ways that we couldn't do before. And so we're going to have to either leverage those or get disrupted by them. So I think the big changes in innovation for companies is figuring out what are the potential disruptors and how do we get ahead of that. And it's going to be different, I think, for company to company. Financial services might be blockchain. For logistics like UPS, it might be 3D printing. So it's really just trying to figure out what are going to be the key players, and then you can leverage things such as AI and augmented reality to help even speed up that process.
Yeah, what's interesting is the dialogue so much is around America. But of course, you know and I know that that's not how innovation works. We're now living, and have been since the 80s, in this global web. So this is certainly something we're all having to deal with. I want you to give a piece of advice to somebody who's just starting out in this field. If you were to give them a little bit of advice, what would you advise them to do if they really wanted to make their career as an innovator in any particular area? I know one size doesn't fit all, but if you wanted to give a piece of advice, what would you tell somebody new to the field? Somebody's graduated, they're a couple years out, what would you tell them?
I think the first thing is don't chase bright, shiny objects, which is a lot of people who get into the innovation field, myself included, love novelty, we love variety. And, that might be the spice of life, but it's the death of a lot of innovators. So, you look at some of the most successful companies, they hammered in on something and then they hammered in on something else. And I think that's really the key, is recognizing innovation is a discipline. It is a process. It is not the same as creativity. And we need to really treat it as a discipline. If otherwise, we're not going to get the results we want.
Now, let's turn it to the other side. You're an experienced CEO. You're 3 years away from retirement and going down to Florida, living in Naples, or wherever you get it in your head to go. What piece of advice do you have for that person who's really trying to just hang on, get their organization to the next place before they cash out?
Well, I guess it depends on their mindset. There's two types of people in that situation. The one is, I'm going to make sure I don't screw anything up. And then there are those who want to leave a legacy.
Right.
And it really depends on which one you're talking to. If they're the ones who are in that first category, I say get out of the way quickly and start getting your succession plan in place so we can start making momentum. Otherwise, you lose 3 years, your company could be out of business.
Yep.
Because, just 3 years is a massive amount of time these days.
Absolutely.
But if you want to leave a legacy, that's awesome. And then what you need to do is just recognize that you're not the expert as the CEO, but you want to empower the teams inside the organization and help them drive and innovation into every pocket of the company. And then you will leave a culture, not just products and processes, but you leave a culture that's going to stand much longer than any leader will.
Great. Now, I'm an old dog, so I'm going to talk to a younger dog here, but I want you to tell us a story of an innovation you worked on. I know you work with a lot of companies like I do, but one that surprised you. One that really kind of didn't, we used to call them crazy Ivans back in the day, right? That didn't quite go the way you thought it would go, right? You don't have to tell what the company was if you don't want to, but tell us a story about how even you were surprised at innovation.
Wow, I'm surprised all the time. One of them is, and this I can talk about, I was tangentially involved in this. It was some open innovation work that NASA was doing.
Yep.
And, they're very innovative, and they were they've been big into open innovation. And one of their challenges was what they called their zero gravity laundry system challenge, which was really, how do we send people up into space, and how do we get, send a washing machine into space that works without gravity? And that doesn't work so well. And the challenge did not go the way they wanted it to go. And it was because it was too complex. It was about pumps and valves and pipes. And so that just didn't work. But what's interesting is if you look at the solutions where it ultimately went, changing the question yielded better and different solutions. So the first question was, how do we get clothes clean? Different than sending a washing machine into space. But then you change one word in that. How do we keep clothes clean? And now we move from cleaning solutions to a material science question in antimicrobials. So I guess I'm always surprised by how subtle changes in a question
Yep.
Even one word in a question can fundamentally change the possible range of results.
You know, it's interesting. There's that, you have to go back a ways. There's that famous MIT study of asking professors and asking CEOs what's the most important thing in innovation. And of course, the professors all say these creative ideas, and the CEOs say getting the problem right, which is what you're really advocating here. Yes. I think that's very important. Can you give us just a soundbite of kind of how you became who you became? Do you have a backstory? We're not asking for skeletons. We're none of that. That's on the news all the time these days. But sort of the PG story of how Stephen became Stephen.
Well, and it's great to share this because I don't get asked this very often. I don't know if you remember, but back in the early 90s, business process reengineering was a huge thing.
Yep.
And when I was at Accenture, back then Anderson Consulting, I was one of the leads of our business process reengineering practice. It was huge. We had 40% of the market, and it was like half of our revenues came as a result of reengineering projects. It was just massive. So I would travel around, I'd help companies re-engineer, and what I discovered was that re-engineering became an excuse for downsizing.
Right.
And I saw the impact of lost jobs on people. In fact, one project I was on, 10,000 people were going to lose their job.
Yep.
And I saw a news story about 3 executives of that company who lost their jobs a year earlier and how it devastated their lives. And I actually walked off the project. I took a leave of absence. I actually quit Accenture at the time. They didn't process the paperwork, fortunately, but after 6 months of paying me vacation time, which I didn't have that much accrued, I said, look, I will come back if we can do something around innovation and growth. I don't want to cut jobs. I want to grow jobs. And that's how it came about. And fortunately, I met up with the right people who had the right power, and we created this great 20,000 person practice around innovation. It was wonderful.
It's funny. We have some origin stories that are similar. I was an advisor, what was called the First Friday group for Hammer and Champy when they wrote the book. And it was very interesting being an innovation person saying, well, this is what we call back-end innovation. And of course, what turned out was everybody said it did everything. And of course, it didn't. And that's one of the challenges. You write a lot about this, and I think it's very well worth the read. Now, where can we learn more about your work? I know you've got this amazing video on your webpage. It sort of encapsulates your philosophy. How do we find you? How do we start learning about Stephen Shapiro?
I mean, the best way is just go to steveshapiro.com. That's where, and that'll be the portal to everything else. If you want to learn about personality poker, that's there. Or you can go to personalitypoker.com. But pretty much anything that I have, you'll find on my main website, and then you can navigate into little bits and pieces from there.
Final question from me. What are you working on now?
So having been in the speaking business for nearly 20 years on my own, and for a number of years before that with Accenture, I've realized that there's a lot of changes happening in the speaking industry. And so I want to make sure I'm not disrupted. So as an innovator, I'm looking at my business model, and I'm very excited about some of the things I'm doing to deliver my innovation content in a fundamentally different way that is going to add more value than I've ever been able to add to my clients for less money. And I don't have to get on a plane, which to me is the best part.
Yeah, that's something I did years ago with these labs and building this MOOC, is the whole idea of, not that we like speaking, right? We should say that, but just we want to have a bigger footprint. And I really appreciate that. Stephen, thank you so much for being on Office Hours. And we'll look for your new work. We'll look for all the interesting stuff that's coming out, and best wishes to you.
Thanks. Take care, Jeff.